Oh yeah. Hey yo, it's the Russo show. Hey yo, it's the Russo show. Oh wow, yeah man.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of Pizza Film School. Today we're going to be talking about the movie of the week, The Evil Dead, directed by Sam Raimi, released in 1981. Pizza Film School is based on movies that were hugely influential. My brother and I, we love genre films. This, of course, being a quintessential example of the horror genre. Our returning guests are Christopher Markus and the wonderful Pete Hammond. Tonight, I am eating from Vito's Pizza. They got locations in WeHo and Santa Monica and DTLA. You guys got some pizza tonight?
Patsy D'Amore's Pizza from the Farmer's Market.
Love and Salt in Manhattan Beach, right there.
So get out there and support your local restaurants. I want to go through the background of this movie a little bit before we start talking about it, because I think the background is as fascinating as the film. Raimi directed this. I believe he was 20 years old. He met Bruce Campbell and Robert Tabbert, who Tabbert is the producer. The three of them met in high school. They made a short film called Within the Woods, 30-minute short film that he shot on Super 8 for about $1,600 over a 3-day weekend. I think you could probably point to this movie as this sort of godfather of independent DIY cinema in the U.S. At the time it was released, not long after this, Steven Soderbergh made a splash at Sundance with his film, and you started seeing DIY filmmakers with very little money making movies that had wide commercial success and jump-started careers. So if you go back and think about Raimi raising $300,000 to shoot Evil Dead when he was 20 years old, cast his buddy Bruce Campbell. Bruce was supposed to be the producer of the film, and the reason they put him in the lead was because he was actually going to be there for the entire shoot, so they figured that was one less cast member they'd have to pay. And this, of course, jump-started one of the great cult acting careers of the last few decades. They shot in very challenging conditions in Tennessee. Raimi's from Detroit, and it sounds like it was an absolutely awful shoot for everyone involved, living in that cabin for a few weeks with no running water. I'm not sure that they were using Jennies for electricity. The most important aspect of the history of this film is that Joel Cohen was the assistant editor on this movie. He worked for Edna Paul, and Cohen and Raimi became friends. The Coens, of course, wrote his second film, which was called Crime Wave. Coens also borrowed some techniques from Raimi, which include the shaky cam, which is that 2x4 camera that Raimi made famous as the POV of the demon in the woods. You can see that use of that shaky cam in Blood Simple. You can see the very famous use of it in Raising Arizona when they're chasing Nick Cage through the house, and there's a racing shot that goes up into the nursery. So a really interesting intersection of U.S. film history on this $300,000 horror film shot in Tennessee. What were your thoughts?
Well, in the last 24 hours, I've watched Evil Dead, Within the Woods, and most of Evil Dead 2. It's amazing. He made the same movie 3 times. He just kept going back to it and going, I can do it better, and finding his style. I mean, I think I'm a bigger fan of Evil Dead 2 than I am of Evil Dead 1. He found his voice more fully in 2. It's great. It's gross. And it's a weird combination of the 70s going into the 80s. They look like typical slasher victims, but there's something more going on than there usually is.
It's deconstructed grindhouse. It's very self-aware.
Evil Dead 1 is fascinating to me. First of all, the way you described it and all of that, and the way he got this made at that age, and the way he got it distributed with an NC-17 rating, which people obviously shy away from every way they can, is pretty impressive in that regard. And watching the movie again, I can absolutely see 40 years later why it got an NC-17 and why it might still. When you look at a rape scene involving a tree and a woman, the character Cheryl here, that would not fly today. They would slap something on that right away. And you look at that particular scene and your jaws drop. And it's pretty impressive considering all that's come since. The way the horror genre has repeated itself and over and gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And this movie holds up for things I haven't seen before or since attempted in some of this stuff. You know, I think Evil Dead 2, and then it turned into a television show and franchises and Army of Darkness. Got more humor in it, although it just does have a level of humor that I thought was interesting too.
Yeah, it's subversively camp. It's interesting because Evil Dead 2 embraces its camp full force, and I think it's almost masochistic towards the lead character of Ash. It's certainly self-aware of its masochism towards that character in Evil Dead 2. This is why I wanted to talk about the sort of inflection point between Raimi and the Coens, because they both have a very similar approach to filmmaking. They tear apart the genre that they're working in. At the same time, they elevate it to heights that very few filmmakers can. So it's this weird combination of insane levels of craftsmanship meeting pure deconstruction. Are they elevating, or are they destroying or flipping on its head? And that weird combination is what created that energy behind the Evil Dead. And then he refined in Evil Dead 2, certainly in Blood Simple, certainly in all the Coens' early work, perhaps in all of their work.
Yeah. Well, there's always that kind of silly accusation from some people that the Coens are only making fun of their characters. And I could see that being leveled at Evil Dead too, where he's got a distance from the story he's telling and a distance from the characters, but it's more celebratory than mocking, I think. And I don't think the Coens ever make fun of their characters. It's almost, I don't know whether it would have happened in the 70s. It has to have happened in the 80s, where people have absorbed enough cinema by this point that they now have an encyclopedia in their head. They're deliberately using genre tropes in a way that doesn't seem like people were doing before. They were just trying to make a scary movie. Now I'm commenting on scary movies as I make a scary movie.
Yeah, it's interesting. It came out the year after the first Friday the 13th, which sort of was a watershed movie in a sense. It was a studio movie, but it was one that sort of changed the style of horror movies, or what we define as horror. This is closer to what George Romero might have done, more edgy and risk-taking. And then they started doing the same kind of movie over and over and over again. And Evil Dead isn't quite there where Friday the 13th, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, all those franchises took off and went. This was its own little creature and very unique within it. And as a zombie movie, it's still, I mean, when you look at all the zombie stuff, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, these effects that they got for the amount of money they're paying there, I mean, it's really amazing.
And at a physical cost. I mean, those white eyes were glass.
For God's sake, what happened to our eyes?
And apparently the actors can only have them in for 10 or 15 minutes. So I think there was a lot of physical suffering on the movie. But it is an accomplished filmmaker working with very limited tools. And when you get to the last 20 minutes, and Ash is the only one left, maybe the most compelling storytelling of the entire film, because he goes into this existential sound design exploration that are completely unexpected. You can't tell whether it's going to take itself seriously or not. And then suddenly it goes into expert craftsmanship. And not that there isn't throughout, because his camera angles are really interesting. That filmmaking, when he's down in the basement, the design, the projector, the blood. Then when he goes upstairs and you're dealing with the ticking clock, and the wide lenses that Raimi has basically, I think, made famous. Accelerated wide lens movement. He's one of the first to pioneer that. I'm trying to think of who else did. The Coens, of course, became very famous for using wides as well. But in this film, he uses it to incredible effect. The POV camera of the monster, right? This is just like Jaws. You don't have any money to see the shark. You don't have money to build the demon in the woods. So everything's played from a point of view. And that intense grinding sound design that is underneath it is so sophisticated.
Scotty, I think there's something out there.
The modulation of the voices when they're demons, I think, become a standard for how people treat voices in horror films.
4 of hearts, 8 of spades, 2 spades, jack of diamonds, jack of clubs.
Why have you disturbed our sleep?
So he was doing things that were exceptional and that have forever impacted the genre.
I would add the musical score by Joseph LoDuca, who's billed here as Joe LoDuca. And I've always been a fan of this guy's music. I think he's amazing, but he was about the same age when he took on this movie, and the score is very sophisticated, particularly for one of these low budget kind of horror movies.
Very sophisticated, and helps Raimi walk this line of tone between celebration and absurdism. It's this weird combination of elements that he's playing with. You have that beautiful love theme that plays early in the film, and then when they discover the basement, it's that crazy synth. You're combining these two very weird pieces of composition that shouldn't be in the same movie with each other, and they're about 5 minutes apart. You get the sense that he's emotionally connected to the material at the same time he's laughing at it. I think that's what created what we could call the Evil Dead tone and built a cult around the movie, because you could either take it seriously as a horror fan or be in on the joke with him as a film fan.
Can we talk a little bit about that love theme in that scene with the eyes, where the camera goes back and forth in these bold close-ups with the eyes of those two looking at each other and that playing underneath? I had to go back. I'm trying to think, what is this inspired by? Where's he coming from? I went all the way back to Thomas Crown Affair, the original 1968, which had a similar kind of scene where the camera would go close up on the eyes or the lips between Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway. And I'm just wondering how he came up with that scene. I don't know. I haven't seen him talk about it.
He revisits it then when he's burying her corpse. She keeps waking up and he keeps turning around, and I almost think he was planting it because he knew he was going to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the more accomplished movies from a 20-year-old that I can think of. And I think a lot of it was instinctual, because clearly, Chris, you find Evil Dead a refinement of his technique, which I think was 6 years later. There's a rawness to this that's sort of exploding. There's a mirth in his exploration within the genre. And I think the thing that most impacted me when I first saw this, the high concept of it. You're put in a cabin with people you care about, your sister, your girlfriend, and then those people slowly transform into something that wants to destroy you. And that idea of dismemberment is the only way to subdue the demon. So you have to literally tear apart the people that you love. Yeah. And on a primal level, that hit me. And I'm assuming that that's what hit audiences around the world when the movie came out, was just this notion of like, well, what would I do? He's expert at exploiting it. You bring up that scene. They can go in and out of demonic character, and suddenly it's the person he loves again, and what's he going to do in that situation? So I think that was sort of the ignitable element of it that made the movie so popular.
Oh, Ash, help me, please.
I mean, I almost wonder how much of it they found in the editing. Tonally, was it all on purpose when they were shooting, or were they scrambling to get what they could when they were living out in the woods, going insane, and then realized that you could assemble it in a way?
If I remember correctly, his original cut was over 2 hours, which is interesting to think how much stylization is sitting on the edit room floor. But he wound up at the correct length.
He did have to do reshoots. I think he did about 4 days of reshoots. And at that point, the actors had been through hell. I mean, I don't even know if you could get away with this kind of shoot these days with union rules and things, because this is more Eric von Stroheim filmmaking here in terms of, my cast be damned and everything else. Everything is going for the film and my vision. I mean, I've heard Bruce Campbell talk about just the torture that they were put through, literally.
There's a story Campbell told about how broke they were while making the film, that he went to buy a pack of gum and realized he didn't have enough money for the pack of gum. So I'm going to jump into some of our fan questions here. Let's start off with @Jeremy J. Ninspa. Did they shoot this with high expectations, confident they had something, or were they just grateful it ever got shown?
B.
Yeah.
B. Yeah.
I can assume.
That's an easy one,
right? I don't know that anyone goes into a project like that expecting the kind of response that they got out of it, but we could argue that it launched two incredible careers in filmmaking if you cite the fact that the Coens were inspired by Raimi's DIY filmmaking, and then made a short trailer for Blood Simple that actually had Bruce Campbell in it after Joel Coen worked it. So you could say that without Sam Raimi, you might not have seen the career of the Coen brothers or on the trajectory that they were on. So this film really, like I said, a massive inflection point in American cinema. MJ Phoebus, at MJ Phoebus, did they think this would be such a cult favorite? Similar question, but I got to imagine no. And this has spawned an incredible cult that's lasted Evil Dead 2, Army of Darkness, Evil Dead Remake, Ash vs. Evil Dead. So this is built a universe.
He wants to do it again. He wants to do another Evil Dead, almost going back, and Bruce Campbell doesn't want to go back and revisit Ash from what I understand. But this was just last year. Sam Raimi is talking about going back and doing another version, another edition. So I think he's still energized by the idea that they can add something to this. Obviously, there was a reboot of it in, I think, 2013 that he didn't direct, but they produced.
Fascinating in the world of continuing mythology now. He apparently pitched Army of Darkness as the sequel to Evil Dead, and they were like, we can't go from your $300,000 movie to Medieval Knights. You have to do something in between. But there's a scene in Evil Dead 2 where you see a drawing of Ash from like the 14th century holding up a chainsaw. He's lucky to get a $300,000 movie off the ground, and he's got an idea that it involves going back to the Middle Ages somehow. Like, I'd love to know how he planned to shoot that.
Yeah, with a lot more money.
Yeah.
By the way, the opening of Evil Dead 2, he rewrites the history of Evil Dead 1 in the first 10 minutes. He dispenses. He shoots it again. He dispenses with the other characters. Mm-hmm. It's just Ash and his girlfriend, and it's a setup for a much bigger mythology. By the way, I would argue that this is a mythology universe. I mean, there's such dense mythology in the Book of the Dead, and he explores it. So this is an early example of building a universe in commercial filmmaking. And he did it in horror, which is, a crazy place to be building a universe. Okay, so here's another one. Paco Vision. With Sam Raimi making new projects, can you see his old film style in his new films? I think there's a very clear example in Spider-Man 2. And I think it's when Doc Ock is in the hospital and his legs come alive. And he starts killing the nurses and doctors. It's straight up Evil Dead. He's using the wide lenses and the accelerated frame rates and the sort of getting that sort of grotesque wrapping from the wide lenses, the sound design. I mean, that to me is really, we talked about this last week with Ronan, sound design as a star. Sound design really is a star of this film. And even that voice that is reading the recording is like, it's such dulcet tones.
It is through recitation of these passages that the demons are given license to possess the living.
From that voice, it's like that. Yes, that I couldn't imagine a better voice to have awoken the dead.
Robin Hazarta. Tatir Mano.
Sound design is the most misunderstood art in movies. I reviewed a movie today, another very low budget movie that's running on Amazon called The Vast of Night. And it's a first time filmmaker. And it's the same story in the sense that he's using very little money and doing a really inventive thing, and the sound design just pops. He's telling the story through sound design. It's virtually that. And I really noticed it. I just made a big deal of it in my review. And you're right. Evil Dead is just a tribute to great sound here. And those guys working, and the special effects. Tom Sullivan did that.
It's Tom Sullivan who did it. I'd love to see a documentary on how they created the sound design for this film. The equipment that they were working with. It's staggering. And some of those sounds are so embedded in my psyche from my childhood. If you were to ask me the scariest thing I saw as a kid, it was those voices. And I remember her in the basement trying to push her way out, and the giggling and the, these sort of very primal moments that were really impactful.
Drives everyone insane, including the viewer.
This is an interesting question. Miguel Guerrero asks, was Scott supposed to be the main character because halfway through the film it seemed to shift to Ash? And I think that's a good question.
I don't know about supposed to be. He certainly presents as the male lead and then crumbles. It's weird. Ash is not a fully realized character yet in this movie. Campbell isn't really doing Bruce Campbell yet. He's acting relatively straight, so you don't notice him, and he sort of comes into being during the movie. So whether that was on purpose or he found out one of them was better than the other.
Yeah.
There's a moment where I don't know the actor's name, I'm afraid. The blonde friend, the guy we're talking about.
That's the problem right there.
His girlfriend has been sucked through a window. She screams, she's gone, there's a broken window. He walks in and he's like, weird. Like, he's not even, like, it makes it almost seem, it doesn't seem real, but it seems almost like a snuff film. Like, that these are real people and you're just going to kill them. Because, they're not actors. Clearly, they're not actors.
And he almost did kill them. So.
Again, to great effect, Chris. Yeah. Made a lot of money with that subconscious effect. Self-made cyborg asks, I'd like to know more about how they filmed certain scenes like the long shots going from outside to inside the cabin. This is, like, you have to marvel at this. If you just think about what they had to do. They literally had a camera mounted on a 2x4 that either one person would hold handles and operate, or they'd lengthen it and two people would run with the camera. And you think about smashing through those doors and those windows, especially on the lenses that he's using, these wider lenses. That requires incredible choreography with you and some other 20-year-old, either with like a hammer or a crowbar, poking in to smash the window before you go through it with the camera, hoping you don't get sliced up and wind up in the hospital, or smashing a door down before you go through it. This is incredibly adventurous and very brave camera work. And again, I think it's part of why this movie is a cult favorite and why the Coens were inspired by it, because it's so visceral. To have a camera that can actually smash through objects, I don't know that I'd ever seen that before.
Well, it's also weirdly money-saving, though. You don't have to show your big monster, ever. You're fully aware of its presence and you never see it. It's a great idea. I think Lost pretty much stole. The smoke monster used to just whip through the jungle, and you'd hear that ratcheting sound, kind of like whatever it is you hear when the evil's going through the forest. It worked.
The imagination is more powerful than, which is important for filmmaking, right? It can be more powerful than what you actually see.
Well, that's it. That's the classic thing you see in the best movies in this genre or close to the genre. The opening of Jaws is a great example of that. You don't see it. You see her. And it's more terrifying than almost anything I've seen on film. That kind of scene. Too much is too much.
Thank God the shark broke, because those yellow barrels are far scarier than a
I
shark.
know, right? I know. Out of necessity comes really great filmmaking.
Well, the score became the shark. That was that built the tension, right? And there's some very famous stories of people passing out in Jaws or having to be carried out of the theater, again with a creature you don't see until the end of the movie. So just the exercise of tension was so much for them that made them faint or vomit or,
Do you think we are missing out on those moments because we can now do anything, so we never have to compensate?
Yes, I absolutely do. Great filmmakers will always find a way to do things differently, but I do think it's become, with computer graphics and everything else, a different world.
Yeah.
I mean, I sit through so many movies, and so many of them are just so derivative to me. The great ones just energize you. And when you see something inventive, it's easier not to be. So you really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Is that why horror is still a prized genre by audiences, because of the limitations? I mean, Blumhouse has built an entire industry out of horror. Is it because filmmakers are limited, the exercise becomes tension without seeing things? I'm thinking of something like It Follows, that has incredible effect with one, without seeing, then two, with when you do see the sort of pace at which it moves.
Recently, I would point to the Invisible Man remake with Elizabeth Moss. Have you seen that? Because it's one terrifying scene when he just appears. The audience just screamed. It was like old-fashioned in that sense.
Yeah.
And she's playing against something she can't see. And that is the terror. So it really is the victim in this became the star of it. It was not the invisible man. It was what you don't see through her that made it so effective.
And what is it about horror that appeals so much to audiences? What do we see in it?
The ones I like are the ones where there's a creepy sense of realism that is then injected with this thing that hopefully doesn't happen in your real life. It's wish fulfillment in a weird kind of way. I think half the reason people like zombie movies isn't the zombies. It's the idea that you can go into any house and take whatever you need to survive. You can go into any store, take anything. The rules are gone. What would you do in your life if a psychopath came through the front door instead of the Amazon guy? You get to test the limits of your life safely in a theater.
And it's a communal experience, and there's very few of those. And comedy is too in its own way, but horror is unique in that regard. And there's something so simple that can just set off an audience collectively that everybody can relate to. I think of a movie, when a stranger calls, and it's finally revealed the call is coming from inside the house.
Stop calling me, you
Listen to me. We traced the call. It's coming from inside the house. You hear me? It's coming from inside the house.
Oh my God.
Well, it's interesting you said horror and comedy, because this is a horror comedy, and they became even more so. It's not a genre that's been mined too often, and I can't think of a recent one. It seems like an 80s genre that I really enjoyed. Do you remember House?
Oh, yeah. I loved House.
Yeah, it has a similar tone where you're laughing, and it's also really creepy.
That tone is very difficult to hit.
One movie we forgot that was really directly influenced by this was Cabin in the Woods, a recent example, I think, of comedy meets horror. This is a great way to wrap up. So I want to thank you guys for joining us this week. Pete, always great to have you. Chris, I'm going to see you again next week. Next week, guys, we have perhaps the most important movie or the most important influence on my brother and I as commercial filmmakers. And we have a very special guest. So tune in next week. And thank you, everybody. And guys, we'll see you soon.
Thanks, man.
Take care.